I started lifting weights seriously when I was 19 years old. I went from a scrawny 77.2 kilograms on a 198 centimeter frame, that's 6'6", 170 pounds for the United States, to 118 kilograms, 260 pounds. Now, to be clear, I did not merely gain muscle. I absolutely gained body fat as well. But considering my starting point, I was A-okay with that reality. Eventually, I slimmed down, dropping 18 kilos, 40 pounds, and have hovered around there for the last many years. But what I'd like to tell you about is the first part, the muscle growth specifically. You see, when I first started, I was an absolute moron and rather pathetic at working out. You don't have to take it from me. You can even ask my first workout partner who taught me the basics when I first started.
At first, he was terrible. He was absolutely terrible. So he had the spirit, he had the motivation, but you could tell when he was working out that his body didn't know what to do. His muscles weren't used to it. And I'll give an example. When doing bent over rows with the barbell, his back would arch. His back would arch so much, and I would keep telling him, like, Nick, you got to keep your lower back straight. You got to keep your lower back straight. You know, act like you're sticking your butt out as far as you can. And he got it conceptually, but his body would not agree with his brain, no matter how hard he tried. In the beginning, his lower back, and he would just be arched over real bad. And, he was pretty terrible.
Bottom line, I sucked. But I desperately wanted to get a lean, mean, fighting machine of a body to attract all the ladies. So, motivations aside, how did I do it? And don't you dare tell me that I still haven't achieved it. Sina helped me get an understanding of the basics, but I really wanted to understand much more. So I started reading anything and everything that I could, from Arnold's bodybuilding book to forums to studies. And it's that last one, as I got better and better at reading these studies, that led me to changing my entire outlook on maximizing muscle growth. So I recently thought to myself, if I were my 19-year-old self, what would I tell myself so I can skip the BS and focus on the proven, effective methods that lead to a muscular physique? Well, here we are. Volume. You may have already seen some of my more ancient content discussing volume, but I'll add a bit more here for the hungry mind. Volume is, quite simply, the total amount of work that you perform over a given amount of time. So, for example, you lifted 2,000 kilograms with your quadriceps over a week's time. That could be over one grueling session or over 3 sessions of 667 kilograms per session, or however you organize it. But you ultimately lifted X amount of weight over X amount of time. Those variables are up to you on how you want to measure them. Okay, well, what about it? Well, if we look at recommendations offered by a scientific review of the literature, we see that the researchers offer volume as one of the primary drivers of hypertrophy, that's muscle growth. We see that evidenced in the meta-analysis that they reference, wherein the researchers took 15 studies and attempted to tease out if changes in volume, again, that's total work done, influenced muscle growth. They found that the greater the volume on the muscle, the greater the muscle growth. We see that detailed here, looking at the total number of weekly sets of an exercise. A set is the total number of times that you lift a weight within one exercise attempt, with each time that you lift the weight being called a repetition. Now, you may already know that, but just in case you don't, now you do. Anyway, they looked at the number of sets performed, and they found that performing less than 5 sets per week led to some muscle growth, as seen by the moderate effect size. However, doing more led to a greater effect, and doing 10 or more led to the greatest effect. Now, there's some nuance to apply here, and we'll get into some more detail on one of those crucial nuances by discussing it in greater depth, namely the difficulty or intensity of each set, but I'll leave that for later. However, what else I wanted to add is the recovery potential. Doing more sets is only more beneficial up to the point that you can appropriately recover from the work that you put on the muscle. If you cannot recover adequately, then more sets would lead to worse muscle growth effects. So it's a fine line. So the verdict is more sets, more muscle growth with some nuances applied. Repetitions. I briefly mentioned these in the volume section, but there's been this push in the bodybuilding communities and other areas that there's an optimal muscle growth repetition range. As in, there's a muscle strength repetition range, a muscle growth repetition range, and an endurance repetition range. Is that true, however? No. Well, mostly no. If we revert back to our initial scientific review, the researchers point out that may be the case when discussing strength, especially, but that is unlikely to be the case when discussing muscle growth. To be clear, gaining muscle, regardless of the repetition range used, leads to a stronger body, but maximizing strength may not come down to muscle size alone. But back to muscle growth. The researchers of this review cite this study as one of their pieces of evidence in favor of the repetition ambiguity transmuscular trophic potentiation theory, or RAT-PT, which is a word salad that I just made up to sound smarter. But they do cite this study. And if we look at it, the scientists show that if they put individuals on a training program that requires them to lift a lighter weight for 20 to 25 repetitions, or if they require other participants to lift a heavier weight for 8 to 12 repetitions, which has always been thought to be the optimal hypertrophy range, there is no difference in muscle growth. We see that evidenced here, with both repetition ranges leading to muscle growth, but neither condition outperforming the other. Okay, so according to that study in the main scientific review, researchers indicate that repetition range may not matter, but there is a problem with that conclusion. One, if we equate volume, meaning if we make sure that both groups lift the same amount of total weight over a set time, so like a week, the results are heavily in favor of performing fewer repetitions. The researchers point this out by mentioning a study which had participants perform the same leg exercise on both legs, but one leg they performed using 8 repetitions, and the other leg they performed 36 repetitions for the same volume, so the amount of work, but obviously at a much lighter weight. Ultimately, as seen here, with the white bar being the 36 repetition condition and the gray bar being the 8 repetition condition, they found that both legs gained muscle, but the heavier load for fewer repetitions led to greater muscle growth. So either 36 repetitions is too high of repetitions, or the load is too light. The verdict at this point is repetition range likely doesn't matter, with some caveats, which we'll discuss next. That leads us into our next point of emphasis, intensity. Intensity is the difficulty of the sets and repetitions. So you can ask yourself, how close am I to not being able to lift this weight? That will give you a decent measure of intensity. What I would like to hammer home is the missing piece that intensity fills that is missed by volume and repetition ranges. Because if we stop the video here, we'd walk away thinking, okay, great. I can just lift really light weights for 100 repetitions each set and perform infinite sets, and then I'll be absolutely jacked. Not quite how it works, because there is a minimum threshold of difficulty that the muscles must experience to maximize muscle growth. That's where our intensity discussion comes in. The researchers mention that anything around 30% of one repetition maximum is around the minimum intensity needed to experience significant muscle growth. What does that mean? There's a metric known as the 1 repetition maximum. It's exactly as it sounds. You pick an exercise and load the exercise with weight to find out what weight you can do the exercise for 1 repetition with no chance of performing another repetition. That's your 1 repetition maximum and indicates the 100% intensity mark. So if you take that 100% weight, you know what? Let's just use an example. You perform a barbell squat and you lift 100 kilograms for 1 repetition, but it's extremely difficult and you definitely can't perform another repetition. That means 100 kilograms is your 100%. So then 30% of one repetition maximum would be around 30 kilograms. That's pretty light, but you won't be performing it for one repetition anymore. See, that's too easy and your muscles won't respond. So you have to increase the repetitions. Now, you can either do one repetition, which we already know is too easy, or you can keep doing repetitions until you hit failure, which is the point at which your body is so tired, so used, that you can no longer lift the weight, even if it used to be super light relative to your one repetition maximum. You're really feeling that burn in your muscles and the weight is barely moving anymore as you lift it. Okay, somewhere in that range is an optimal intensity. A systematic review looking at that answer ultimately landed on the idea that stopping around 3 to 4 repetitions shy of failure is probably best practice. But why not failure itself? I mean, surely if we tax our muscles to the maximum, that would lead to the greatest stimulation and thereby stimulate muscle growth maximally, no? Well, that one requires a bit of a nuanced answer. First, much like our previous point on volume, if you can't recover between sets or between workouts, then training to failure is impeding your progress. It's suboptimal. Logically, if you train to failure on all your sets, you're likely doing less work compared to if you leave a few repetitions in the tank because, well, for obvious reasons, you're less tired and can perform more work if you stop a few repetitions shy. If we look at a meta-analysis that investigated that question, there was a likely slight benefit to training to failure, although the analysis was performed with a limited number of studies, which makes the conclusion less certain than I would like. If the overall effect diamond pulls to the right, it means the weight of the results from the included studies indicates an effect in that direction. So in this case, pro-failure training. Still, that does not mean everyone needs to train to failure. But what it does tell us is that a range of 3 to 4 repetitions shy of failure up to failure, assuming that you can recover adequately, leads to optimal intensity. Overall, you don't have to train like Arnold Schwarzenegger and Ed Corney.
180 and flexible, come on. Yeah.
But you do want to make sure that you're putting yourself through your paces, unless maybe you too are on steroids. So you'll want to incrementally increase volume. You have significant flexibility in your repetition ranges to fulfill that volume. So I'd stick between 1 and 20 and likely aiming for 5 to 20 would be even better considering the beating that you'll take trying to achieve higher volumes with repetitions so low, indicating a high resistance weight lifted per repetition. And you should train anywhere between 3 and 4 repetitions shy of failure, all the way up to failure. And all of that comes at the mercy of your ability to, 1, recover, and 2, progress, which is an element that I haven't discussed, but it is vital. You need to be implementing some form of progression, if it's workout by workout, week to week, or for those more advanced lifters, mesocycle by mesocycle. Now, speaking of those more advanced lifters, do these principles still apply? Well, I don't want to take up too much more of your time, but there have been studies in more advanced lifters, not necessarily elite, but intermediate to advanced. People who have been seriously lifting for a number of years. In one study, more seasoned lifters were recruited and split into a low repetition group or a high repetition group, but the volumes between groups were equated, and they performed their exercises to near or at failure. And were the results different from what we've discussed? Well, look for yourself. The high repetition group is on the left, pre and post training for 2 months, and the lower repetition group is on the right, pre and post training. There were increases in muscle mass for both groups, but no differences between groups. So no, the results were not different. So according to this study, the same rules apply. That said, that doesn't mean there isn't more context that may need to be applied in more advanced lifters, but at least it's not an outright rejection of the concepts that we discussed earlier. Naturally, we should talk about nutrition too, because I certainly didn't gain 40 kilos, 90 pounds by simply lifting weights, but that's the other half of the equation. Let's leave it here for now, and we'll revisit the nutrition for optimal muscle growth in another video.
But what about training frequency?
I just know I'm going to get this question. So let's go ahead and get this over with before the questions come hailing in. If you didn't get juked by the black screen indicating an end to our story, post "I wasn't fooled, jester" in the comments. Okay, last and not least, training frequency. How often do you need to train per week to fit in all of that volume at the appropriate intensity using a wide range of repetitions? Again, let's rely on a meta-analysis of 7 studies. This meta-analysis compares in equated volume situations, which you'll notice I've pointed this out a number of times because if you don't control for volume, you have a powerful confounding variable on the loose. And then we have to rein that bad boy in so that we can make the appropriate conclusions on frequency. Anyway, volume equated, does exercising more frequently yield better muscle growth potential than exercising less frequently? The answer is, let's look at the data. Remember, we're focusing on the overall effect diamond in our simplistic perusal of the data, and we see it moves in favor of higher frequency being better for muscle growth. But context needeth be applied. 1, there are limitations to this analysis. There's only 7 studies, which meant that the researchers didn't have the requisite pool of data to determine if 3 sessions per muscle group per week was better than 2 sessions. They were only able to determine that 2 sessions is better than 1. 2, I have to annoy you again, but all of this is a moot point if your recovery is trash. If you can't recover from 2 sessions, you shouldn't even be thinking about 3. And 3, look at your schedule. What fits best? If you can only do it once a week, committing to more when it's not feasible is an exercise in futility. Additionally, how much is 2 sessions going to speed things up? Well, fortunately, we can look at the effect size calculated in the analysis. The effect of once a week versus nothing is 0.3, and the effect size for twice a week is 0.49. So the difference in effect size between once versus twice a week is therefore likely small. It might make a difference over time, but it's not like you'll be doubling your muscle accrual by going twice a week. So the verdict is twice a week per muscle group is better than once a week. And there's no evidence for 3 times a week, which requires more data than we have. But ultimately, going 3 times a week will likely only be beneficial if you properly recover, which becomes less and less likely the more often that you put your muscles under significant load. And now, ladies and gentlemen, I am done. See you around. Or am I? Yes, I am.